Yep.
Welcome to day 2 of Toward a New Way of Being with Plants. I'm Susan McHugh, and it is my deep pleasure to moderate this session, which is titled Building a Movement to Advocate for More Respectful and Ethical Treatment of Plants. Our featured speaker is Paul Moss, whom we all have to thank for his tremendous work for organizing this amazing conference as well. Paul is a third-year PhD student at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Society, where he's focusing on the relationship between people and plants. He has degrees in biology, agronomy, and marketing. Paul is also founder and executive director of the Plant Initiative, a nonprofit organization started in November 2020 that works collaboratively with others to advance respectful treatment of plants. And I'll put the link to it in the Q&A, which reminds me also that we ask you please to post your questions to the Q&A rather than to the chat function to make it easier for me and my fellow moderator, Mike Nevala, to make the most of them. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Paul.
Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone today. I'm, been spending a lot of my time helping to put together this conference. So it's this is something that I hope will turn out okay in terms of trying to do a presentation as well. So the question really before us is there doesn't seem to be a movement right now that's focused on respectful and ethical treatment of plants, like there are many, for animals and other beings and other environmental aspects. So the question is really, what is it time really for there to be such a movement? And what specifically could this movement accomplish? And who might collaborate in such a movement? And how can plants themselves maybe even contribute to this effort? So these are the questions that I'm interested in exploring right now. So first, let's talk about, is this the time? And I guess to the answer, just to cut to the chase, I would say, yes, it is time right now. And I'll go through 10 specific reasons why I think it is time that we have a movement that is advocating for more respectful and ethical treatment of plants. First of all, there's been a lot of work in scientific findings for looking at how complicated plants are. And this has to do with some of the things that people have been hearing at the conference today. There's plant communication, there's plant sentience, there's plant, all types of intelligence. So there have been a lot of ways that scientists are now thinking about how plants are a lot more complicated and than we previously have thought about. So I would say the scientific findings are really drawing people into looking at plants in a new way and potentially to interact with them in a new way. Another thing would be plant philosophy. We're pleased to have Matthew Hall doing one of the pre-recorded sessions today. There's Michael Martyr, and there's many others, Giovanni Allo, and there's many others who have been looking, and many who are here today and yesterday at this conference, we're looking at plant philosophy. So I think that they're within the academy, these plant philosophers that are starting to really look deeply at the way that plants have been looked at in the West and how plants are looked at in the academy, have also started to open another channel towards people looking at plants and reacting to plants in a different way. The next I would say is just environmental ethics. We're seeing that environmental ethics has become an extremely populated field of study. A lot of it's been focused more at the general environment and not necessarily specifically at plants. But when you look at what is the environment, you look at the fact that land plants make up like 90% or more of the biomass on the planet, then you really can see that environmental ethics, a lot about that, the environment is, in terms of living environment, is plants. So I think a lot of the attention to environmental ethics as a field has helped to pave the way for more serious inquiry and attention to plants. The animal rights movement, I would say, has been extremely active. There are hundreds and hundreds of groups and millions of people throughout the world that are looking at animal rights. Now, the animal rights movement isn't necessarily looking at plants. They're not actually looking at plants at all, but there's a lot of parallels between the way that you could look at the way that people look at animals and the way that they look at plants. So I would say that the animal rights movement and its successes have really opened the door towards other advocacy movements that could focus on other kingdoms of organisms or other beings. So animal rights is an important thing to consider in terms of why maybe it's time to look at more like plant rights or plant liberation or things like that. There's a whole movement now about rights of nature, which has been going on for probably about 50 years. So starting with Stone's book on Should Trees Have Standing and other inquiries, and now there are several national and international organizations that are focusing on rights of nature. And we're really seeing how rights of nature is becoming more and more integrated into legal systems in countries, into constitutions, and organizations like Earth Law Center, Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, and others are really starting to really focus on the rights of nature. So that's another trend, I think, that speaks towards having plants being considered to have rights as well. There's increasing openness, and you've probably seen this at today's conference, on alternative ways of seeing things. Some of these are indigenous, some of these might have to do with various alternative spiritual traditions or otherwise. And so I think that these are also opening the door towards looking at plants differently, in many cases through psychotropic drugs. People are having direct conversations with plants, other times through just meditative practices or just engagement. And I think you've heard about that at a number of sessions here today. So these are all kind of opening to new ways of thinking about plants and potentially advocating for plants. The Anthropocene, as you've probably heard the term, and it's basically the epoch we're in right now, named a little bit through hubris about humans, but essentially the Anthropocene is the era in which humans are starting to dominate the whole ecosystem of Earth and the whole living and non-living systems of the planet. And so I think that what's happening with plants is that we're seeing that a great deal of plant habitat has been destroyed. A lot of risks to plant populations, plant extinctions, and it's making the need to advocate for plants and protect plants and think about plants come to the forefront, because we're really seeing the destruction of plants, and it's making it a more urgent and actionable issue. So I'd say that's also contributing to the need for such a movement. COVID-19, I think, actually contributed to people looking at plants in a different way. A lot of people have been trapped in their houses. They've not been able to do their normal travel routines or leave. And so there's been a lot more interest in houseplants and engaging with other types of plants in gardens and in the neighborhoods. And so I think that COVID-19 has kind of opened people's connection to plants, both the ones that they have in their homes as well as the ones that they see outside, and has just, I think, slowed things down quite a bit in terms of how people view nature. So that's another trend. And there's just two more. There's 10 of these. Charismatic leaders, I think, are starting to emerge, and they're important in the development of any movement. We have a number of charismatic speakers here today talking about plants, and yesterday, and they're starting to, like what you've seen with Suzanne Simard's recent book, which is, on the bestseller list, and other books, that about the overstory by, so you've really starting to see in the popular culture more interest in plants, and perhaps some of those charismatic leaders have brought people here today to the conference. And then I'd say the last, although not at all the least, is plant agency itself. I feel that plants themselves are calling on humans to partner with them to act in their behalf and act on our common behalf, because the fact is that if humans ruin the ecosystem and humans really destroy a lot of the living ability for this planet, that's going to take down the plants as well as the humans. So there's this natural partnership. And I feel that plants are reaching out to people, maybe subconsciously or consciously in certain cases, but plants want us to work with them, I believe, and to create a movement with their support and involvement that can help to address some of these crises that we're facing, mutual crises that we're facing. So that's a long winded way of explaining that, yes, I feel that it is time for a movement for plant advocacy and plant rights and plant liberation, and that we need to start thinking about how this can happen. So the next question, I guess, for me is, well, what would such a movement do? There's a lot of times people think, well, it's nice that you might want to do things to advocate for plants, but really, what would specifically such a movement do? And I want to go into that a little bit more right now. So one of the missions, I think, of a movement should be advocacy, that an organized effort to consider the needs and rights and intrinsic value of plants, and to advocate for them on their own terms, not because plants are going to provide us with ecological services, not because plants are aesthetically pretty, and not because we just happen to have some kind of an emotional connection with plants, but because plants are complicated, sensitive, intelligent beings that need to be respected and preserved on their own terms. And so I would say we need advocacy for that. Second, we need education and outreach. I think this kind of conference is a step in that direction. And I don't feel this is the end all of conferences. I think that this movement, if it ever takes off, is something that's going to take hundreds of years to evolve. But essentially, we need education and outreach to let people know about these types of issues and to kind of open their minds to different ways of looking at plants. And I think a third general area of having a plant rights or advocacy movement would be to build partnerships. And that means reaching across with the animal rights community, reaching across with the vegetarians and vegans, reaching to the environmental groups, reaching to the tree protection groups. So I think that there's all these potential partnerships, and many that I haven't even mentioned, within the academic community, within the scientific community. There's a need to start building partnerships. It's not like a movement that's going to be able to just thrive and grow on its own. So another question that comes up, okay, so you feel we need, or I feel we need a plant advocacy movement and some general ideas. Now I want to talk more specifically, what would such a movement advocate for? One, I would divide into three categories. One would be to reduce the use and consumption of plants. And there are a lot of dimensions to this, and I want to take time in the next slide to go through them. I know when you do PowerPoint, the idea is not to bore people with long lists, but I think there's two messages that I want to get across here. One is there's a lot of specific things that we can do, and I want to also just go through the list and say what these things are, because each of these is a huge area on its own. Sorry that this keeps advancing. I was not able to figure out how to get the automatic advance to stop, so just bear with me. So avoid waste of food, paper, wood, and live plants. To refrain from unnecessary and destructive use of plants, like for large scale energy production with liquid biofuels and biomass power generation. These are just examples. Consider eating plant parts as foods, like seeds, fruits, buds, flowers, and leaves instead of the entire plant. Allow plants to complete their natural life cycles. Consider that they have a right to have their own life cycle. Reduce consumption of animal products. And I think here there's some great synergies potentially with vegetarians and vegans, because animal products through animal agriculture are often produced at great expense of plant lives. So you can achieve both of these goals, both protecting animals and protecting plants by reducing consumption of animal products. Really one of the most actionable things. And then supporting new ways of growing plants through permaculture, sustainable agriculture, forestry, or horticulture that can reduce the destruction of plants. So my point is there's some really specific things that we can do. And a lot of people are doing things, so just not necessarily doing under the context of plant advocacy. Okay, a second area would be to protect and restore plants. And what does that mean? Again, one would be treating the individual plants in your home, yard, and community respectfully by trying to help them live, provide them with what they need to live. If you have house plants, take care of them. If you have plants growing in your garden, think about it, about their lives as having value. Another is to protect and to restore wild plant habitat and biodiversity. And there's a lot of stress right now on heirloom varieties of plants. So organizations and efforts to preserve diverse seed stocks are important, as well as protecting pollinators, because what we're seeing right now with the collapse in the insect population is translating into tragedy for plants that need these pollinators to be able to reproduce. So focusing on these things that plants need to survive in the wild. Supports organizations that are preserving and protecting trees, and to appropriately plant them. I think tree planting is a little bit of a complicated issue because sometimes trees might be planted in ecologically inappropriate places. And so you want to make sure that not just plant trees everywhere, because trees, there are some places that belong to other plants, not trees. So if you have a prairie, you don't necessarily want to plant trees in the prairie. The prairie plants are adapted to that and grow there. So to be mindful about tree planting, but certainly organizations, and there's many of them that support urban trees and ancient redwoods and other trees and are working for forestry protection. Those are important. And then this gets into a whole nother area, but a lot of things that are affecting huge numbers of plants are these epidemics, like we're seeing with emerald ash borer here in the Midwest in the United States. We've seen with, Dutch elm disease. There's plenty of other diseases that are now affecting plants. And so there are things that we as individuals and that organizations and communities and governments can do that can help to prevent the spread of invasive pest and disease epidemics that are killing off huge numbers of plants. So these are some specific things. And then the third category of actionable items for advocacy, I would say would be to rethink plants. And part of this conference is to achieve that goal. So questioning those assumptions about plants in which they're considered to be just raw materials and resources for humans. That's one of the messages of this conference, is that plants should be considered as valuable in and of themselves, not just for what they are providing for us to use. Hang on. Then reconsider research practices that are not considering the intrinsic value of plant lives and integrity. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be plant research, but I think that needs to be considered. Just like with animal research, there are institutional review boards. There are practices that consider the needs and integrity of the animals that are being researched on. I feel that plants should also be considered, the value of their lives in research practices. Learn more about the complexity of plants, why we should treat them more respectfully. That's again part of what we're doing here at this conference. Explore approaches to plants that are based on traditional environmental knowledge, indigenous perspectives, and then build personal connections with plants that are part of your life. And I know that a lot of the speakers here today have talked about that and why that's important for rethinking plants. So the last group of questions I would have is who is doing this? I would say there's a lot of pieces. You've heard me go through that long list, and thanks for your patience in listening to me. But essentially, there are groups that are doing those things. They're not necessarily talking to each other. They're not necessarily considering themselves as part of a plant advocacy movement. They are working though and doing things that are helping and preserving and respecting plants. So I would include within that, a lot of these tree protection and planting groups, general environmental protection organizations. There's tons of native plant groups. There's a lot of forest protection groups. Pollinator protection is particularly hot right now. There's a lot of attention to vegetarianism, veganism, sustainable agriculture, seed saving organizations. So there are many organizations, this is only a fragment of them, that are working right now to do this. But again, not really framing it in terms of plant ethics, and maybe even uncomfortable in terms of framing it in plant ethics. I think for with like vegetarianism and veganism, I think it's been, for some people working in that area, that pro-animal people, it's been a little threatening to think about plants having sentience or potentially feeling pain. And so, because one of the arguments for vegetarianism has been, it's a sentientist argument. So it basically says that, we should avoid harming beings that can feel pain. And so if clearly animals feel pain, but if plants also could feel pain, which I would assume they do, then I would say that somewhat threatens the arguments for vegetarianism. So I think there's been a little uneasiness from some of the folks in that area about recognizing like plant rights. But in any case, there is certainly an opportunity for plant ethics framing. There's been some effort in that regards. I'd say a really interesting thing is this document, which is called The Dignity of Living Beings with Regard to Plants. It was done by the Federal Ethics Committee on Non-Human Biotechnology, and it's about moral consideration of plants for their own sake. It was done in 2008 in Switzerland. It was chartered by the Swiss government. And so I think it's an interesting document. It doesn't go super far. It was based on a consensus of the committee that put it together. But in terms of looking at a document or an effort that's really looking at plants and the rights of plants, then I think that that's a start. Rights of nature organizations often are really looking at the ethical issues here and looking at the intrinsic values of various aspects of the natural world. And that includes trees and plants and water and landscapes and rivers and lakes and all types of things. But they are framing ethical issues in terms of plants. And I think that's a good example of an organization that's trying to do that. There's indigenous efforts often frame their work to protect the natural world, including plants, in terms of ethics and also those involved with the alternative spirituality in the West often will frame their work with plants in terms of an ethical kind of a context. So there is some things are going on in that regards. But I think for the most part, we're really missing the conscious connections here about like drawing together people from all aspects of working with plants in terms of thinking of themselves as part of a common effort instead of just doing disparate things that may be helping plants but aren't really part of something. So I think the goal really is to, part of the goal of this conference and afterwards, is to bring people together so that they can start thinking about and acting together on behalf of plants. So in terms of follow-up, just to mention, the plant initiative, we started this in November 2020, and we're one of the sponsors, and I'm their volunteer executive director, and I've helped staff the event. And we're seeking to build a movement to increase respect for plants and encourage ethical behavior towards plants, and to support an effective movement towards that goal. So that's one of the things. So if you're interested in that, keeping in touch with us as we start to grow, feel free to go to our website at plantinitiative.org, sign up for our contact list, and we'll be able to follow up with you after the conference. I guess that's what I would say is essentially the main point I wanted to make. I want to thank you for your attention. I've thrown a lot of material at you, and I'd be certainly happy to take any questions that you might have or to engage in discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. It was a wonderful presentation. You've given us a lot to think about. And as an indication, the Q&A is on fire right now. So I'm going to try to start trying to take the questions in order, relaying them to you, give you a chance to think about them a little while you're listening. Uliana writes, David Greenspoon in one of his books wrote that the Anthropocene is an era of humans' childhood that precedes Sapio Terra as a rational earth with sensible and intelligent people. Sounds to me kind of like Ursula Le Guin's The Word for World is Forest concept here. Liliana's question for you is, how do you think the green trend in human living, whether the green trend in human living is a step towards such an intelligent epoch?
I'd like to think it is. I think that that's a really good question. Thank you. I feel that, really, I don't know. I think we're at a kind of an inflection point, here. And I think that our world and our society and civilization can go in numerous directions. I think with the Anthropocene, we're seeing, the kind of destruction is accelerating, and with climate change and all these other aspects are scary and very dangerous. So, but I feel there are counter trends to that, and I think that this incipient plant advocacy movement is one of them. I think that certainly what you're talking about is visions of our Earth as having a healthy and eco-centered and eco-friendly society, and those have been there now for decades and are certainly there. I would say that they're not the dominant narrative right now in our civilization, but they're there. And it could be that with increased problems, associated with ecological devastation, that perhaps, things will flip. I think what we saw with COVID-19 has been an example of how, a virus, a part of the natural world, has had a large impact on human outlook towards the future and human behavior. And I think that could just be potentially the beginning. So I think that, I'm hopeful, I would say, but not necessarily particularly optimistic. I think that it will be a struggle. And I think that we need to, try and work together to bring, to bring up, into being the kind of a future that you're referring to, that would be more earth friendly, earth based, and with humans more integrated into the whole earth system. I lost the video for Susan, and I'm just wondering, can people still hear me?
Hi, this is Mike Navala, one of the moderators. Can you hear me, Paul? Any better?
I hear you, yeah, but I don't see anyone anymore.
Oh, you don't see Susan either. So let's proceed with a question. Hi, everybody. It's just a privilege to be a part of this afternoon. So, Paul, here's another question for you.
Okay.
It has to do with waste in the horticultural industry. Much of it may be consumer driven, but also the growers are making choices. How can we move the growing industry to respect plants and not just grow plants based on market conditions? So to avoid
I think that's a good question. I think the issue is partly right now, what makes everything so challenging with this kind of an approach is that our whole economic system is based on using plants for economic goods without really considering the intrinsic value of the lives of the plants. And I'm not picking on the horticultural industry, and I don't think that the person who asked the question necessarily wanted to focus just on them, but they're within agriculture, horticulture, forestry, landscaping, other types of things that go on with plants, that essentially you're managing plants for economic gain. And so I think sometimes that is going to involve a lot of waste of plant lives. I guess one of the questions, as a first step for the horticultural industry could be to think about, what are the alternatives? Are there ways that we could grow plants and work with plants that would produce less waste of plant lives? I don't, I think there's definitely some economic incentives for them to not waste plant lives. And this just enters another moral, ethical kind of calculation into that. So I wonder, if that's, something that where there could be a kind of a win-win look at that. I mean, I don't know that they would be comfortable necessarily with the ethical framing of it, but they certainly, would be responsive to thinking about ways that they could reduce the waste of plants, since they had invested a lot of resources and time and effort into those plants before they were had to be destroyed. So I think there are a lot of industries that are certainly based on wasting plant lives and not necessarily valuing them at all. So I think that that's a good question, is how does this become actionable?
Good. Is Susan back connected with us audio-wise?
I still don't hear Susan.
Okay, I have another question for you. This is Mike Followup, and this
Okay.
was done with the Q&A. And right now we're at 30 minutes, so we still have some time for Q&A, Paul. Just give us your larger vision for the plant initiative.
Sure. Right now, to be honest, I've been focusing a lot on this conference, and I feel that the conference is really one of the initial efforts that the plant initiative has been able to contribute to. In terms of a larger vision, I really do envision the plant initiative being active on those three areas that I mentioned, in terms of trying to promote advocacy, doing education outreach, and building partnerships. And I feel the building partnerships is particularly important right now, because the plant advocacy as a standalone effort, it's often can be ridiculed. It's not really part of the mainstream. So I think that it would really benefit the plant initiative in the short term to partner with organizations that would be like-minded and would try and support that work. With that said, though, I feel that it is going to evolve. I feel that we don't really know how people will respond to this kind of a message. And I don't think that this type of a message has really seriously been put out there. If you do a Google search right now on like plant rights or plant liberation, you will see a lot of articles that'll come up mocking it and denigrating it and opposing it, even though it doesn't even exist. So I would imagine that it's going to face some degree of resistance, right? So I think that we'll have to see, my nature, and I think the plant initiative's nature is not going to be confrontational and in your face, but is going to try and look for ways of common progress. And so I feel that that's what, and to do it in a way that's comfortable for people that are partnering in with it. So I feel that that's kind of the future direction for the plant initiative, is to try and move things in that direction in a cooperative, collaborative way.
Thank you. Partnerships are very important. Susan, are you back on the audio portion of our?
I'm terribly sorry, Paul. The internet cut out on this end.
That's okay.
I just saw you freeze and thought, oh
No,
no,
that's
at least
good.
it's been going
Well,
fine without me.
You had to put up with my slides that wouldn't stop. So now there's
No worries.
technological challenges. So, but I'm happy to answer some other questions.
Okay.
And unfortunately, in logging back in, the Q&A was erased for me.
Okay.
I know that you got to the first question by Uliana. Did you take the second and the
Yeah, I
third
did.
so far?
Mike, you want to give me another question?
Yes. I'll try to shorten this and summarize this particular question. What about ecosystems that have been taken over with invasive non-native species? You were talking about the rights of plants, but here we are with plants that, whether on their own or with human intervention, are disrupting natural ecosystems.
I think that's a good question. Plants aren't like cuddly victims. you know, one, we have to eat plants to live, and we have to have a essentially violent and somewhat predatory relationship with plants to some extent, because we are dependent on plants to live. So this whole notion of, it's a little different than with animal rights when you're looking at, you know, you could just not kill pandas or something, and then that would be, you know, but this is in our nature as animals. We're dependent on eating plants, and plants themselves are not necessarily all cuddly and nice either. You know, it's just a little bit of a fraught area. So issues of plants can be aggressive. Plants can kill animals, like carnivorous plants, and plants can kill each other, and plants are very challenging. So for humans to manage, and that's why there are people that work in weed science and other areas, is that plants are no joke, you know, and they cost humans a lot. So I think in terms of invasive plants, I don't think there's like a formula where you could say, well, we're just not going to kill any plants. And so I think that it's like a balancing act, and I think that people are going to have to make those decisions. What I'm advocating for, though, is that part of that calculation has to involve the fact that the invasive plants, we don't like them. They're killing the plants that we do like. They're taking their habitat, but they still have intrinsic value as living beings for themselves. So it doesn't mean you can't kill them. It doesn't mean you can't remove them. But it does mean that you have to think about it. You can't just do it like, you know, we're having buckthorn removal day and it's all like fun. It's like you're killing living things that are sentient and intelligent and want to live there. You know, certainly there's been arguments about humans and that whether or not we're invasive, you know, and so I feel like we need to be charitable towards all plants, but not necessarily, you know, treating them without killing them. I mean, we do have to kill plants to live. And in cases of gardening and agriculture and horticulture, you are going to have to remove plants that are in inappropriate areas for what you want. And I think there are ways to do it that are more respectful and won't necessarily, you know, there's ways of maybe, you know, trying to connect with the plants or explain what's happening. But ultimately, it's not a simple situation where it's going to have black and white ability to just say, well, we just, you know, protect plants no matter what. It's not like that.
Thank you, Paul.
Any other questions or?
I think we're coming up at 37 minutes. And if there's just something else in parting, Paul, that you'd like to say based on the questions, and maybe just give us a few comments on the rest of today's conference as our organizer of the conference.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mike. Appreciate it. And thanks to both of you for moderating this session. You know, I guess the point is here is that this is a new venture. This is the start of something. Okay. And so all the answers aren't in, and it's going to be an effort that takes decades, centuries, because the way that humans and in the West have been interacting with plants is not new. And the way that plants have been integrated into our economy and into our worldview is not new at all. It's been going on for thousands of years. And so, you know, it's going to take time, just like it took time to evolve the worldviews that we have now to create new worldviews that are more plant friendly. And so I think that it's something that people need to be patient with, and it's something that people need to be willing to explore and to make mistakes and to try new ideas. And I just think it's a frontier that needs to be explored. It's a line that needs to be crossed to include plants in the kind of moral consideration that we give animals and other beings, and to really see how we can do that in an actualized way. And so that's, I think, the challenge before us. And I hope that people will walk away from the conference today thinking about not just that they learned some interesting things, but thinking, well, how would they apply this? And that's why I went through some of the list. And a lot of the things on the list are on the Plant Initiative's website in terms of what you can do. So think about it and just try and reframe the way you look at plants in the future. So with that, I just want to say thanks so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and feel free to, contact me or otherwise. And thanks again for all of your attention today.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for kicking us into this discussion that I really want to stay in for a very long time. And I think your point about partnerships and reaching out to people who disagree with you is really important, particularly having been someone who's worked with a lot of animal people over time and seeing the polarization with eco people, that's not been productive at all. And that what's been missing a lot from the conversation is exactly the sort of questions that you're asking. And so this is just all very exciting to me. I want to thank you again, not just as being a wonderful presenter, but also a wonderful conference organizer here for hosting as well as presenting. And I wanted to just cue everyone into the fact that the link to your organization is posted to the chat. And also too, that the conference is moving on now to Suzanne Simard's keynote presentation titled Elder Trees Help Heal the Land. That's going to begin at 2:55 CST. And I'm sure that we're all really looking forward to that too.